Hello, and welcome to a webinar hosted by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Our topic today is Insurrection and Accountability in the United States. What just happened and what happens next? I'm John Lindsay, an assistant professor at the Munk School and in the Department of Political Science, and I'm joined by some fantastic colleagues who I'll introduce in just a moment. But we're going to be discussing the events of January 6th, which I think are still fresh in all of our minds. As we were watching, it was remarkable watching the media and later commentators flail around looking for the right language to discuss this. Was this a protest, a demonstration, a mob, a coup, an insurrection? How do these words matter, and what are their implications for the US and the world as we start thinking about a way ahead? It's important to emphasize, I think, how much is still unknown, how much we're still struggling to make sense of this all. This is not even 3 weeks ago, and on 3 successive Wednesdays, we witnessed an insurrection, an impeachment, making Donald Trump the second president in the United States ever to be impeached twice, and an inauguration of a new president, Joe Biden, the new 46th president, calling for unity. And on that day, I think many Americans and perhaps many others around the world breathed a sigh of relief and felt that once again, the American flag stood for all Americans, where all votes matter. But with these three events, right? Does this tie a nice little bow on things? Obviously not. We're still working to make sense and understand this. And today it's starting to become increasingly obvious that the Senate will be moving ahead with the impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump in the next 2 weeks or so. So what just happened and what happens next? I think we're going to be asking these questions not only in this panel, but for some years to come. We have a fantastic panel today. As I mentioned, I'm John Lindsay. I teach classes on global security and intelligence here at the Munk School. And I'll be joined by Alexandra Rohr. She is a lecturer in American Studies at the Center for the Study of the United States at the Munk School. And she specializes in populism, demagoguery, and disaster narratives in the United States. So Alexandra, I think your research agenda has come to a convergence in these events, for better or worse. Carmen Chung, she is a senior fellow at the Munk School and an executive director for the Center for Justice and Accountability based in San Francisco. And Carmen has been working as a practitioner for a long time, working on justice and accountability issues. And last but not least, Professor Kent Roach, the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. So how we're going to organize our discussion today, we'll have a little bit of a look back and look forward. I'll make a few brief comments on kind of the security implications of what happened and what didn't happen. And then I'll turn it over to Alexandra to maybe give us some more historical context on understanding American populism and any potential precedents that might be there. And then we'll turn it over to Carmen and Kent to talk about the issues of where do we go from here? How do we think about accountability, not just with respect to the President of the United States, but members of this movement, this insurrection? How do we think about addressing far-right extremist terrorism in the United States and balancing some of the other civil liberties concerns that this brings up? Okay, so if that sounds like a good plan for everybody else, I'll go ahead and get started. I just want to make a few quick comments on what it is that we observed. There was, and there has been, and there continues to be discussions on, was this a coup? Certainly there was something that was shocking to watch that involved political violence, that involved the transgressing of boundaries that few people expected, at least tactically, to go down like that. But does it make sense to call it a coup? And what's been interesting is that many people that comment on this politically and in the media have said, oh yes, obviously this is a coup, but scholars that study coup, almost to a one, have said, this doesn't quite look like the thing it is that I study, right? The coups that I've looked at in Eastern Europe and Africa and Latin America and other places, right, tend to involve more organization. They tend to involve the collusion of security services. They tend to involve a plan to take over the reins of government. And we just don't seem to see that. Okay, if it's not a coup, then well, what is it? And I think you can see the political stakes of this discussion, right? There's a fear that, well, a coup is serious. If it's not a coup, maybe we won't take it as serious, right? Maybe we won't be able to get the same level of accountability. And I just like to put out there that just because it's not a coup per se, doesn't mean that political violence that is spontaneous or maybe quasi-organized or opportunistic can be, in many cases, even more dangerous than an organized effort to overthrow the government. A scholar, Roger Peterson, who has done a lot of work on Eastern Europe. I'll just kind of mention, it's been fascinating to me as somebody who studies national security to suddenly see all these theories from comparative politics being used to understand the United States itself, but that's a good thing, right? So the United States has always styled itself as an exceptional nation. In some ways, right, is now being seen as a normal country that we can understand with the same tendencies towards political violence and instability that have long existed in other places. Anyway, so Roger Peterson has looked at resistance and rebellion principally in Eastern Europe. And he has made a sharp distinction between organized insurgency, which are often built on bonds of kinship and norms of honor and reciprocity that tend to be based in kind of local movements. At the extreme, they're more bureaucratized. And he distinguishes that from unorganized resistance movements. And he mentions four criteria. One, they tend to be distinguished by widespread resentment and an experience of status inversion. And that does start to, at least a first order of approximation, describe some of the feelings that are voiced in this strange collusion of nativist militia organizations, conspiracy theorists, evangelical movements, white supremacist organizations, very different movements, but all kind of voicing those similar feelings of resentment and status inversion. Shared cultural symbols and focal points, right? Certainly they're supercharged by social media. You saw it in costumes in this carnival atmosphere. Status rewards for risk-accepting individuals that are making the effort to take the opportunity that's presented. They may have prepared for something general, but not something specific. But once there's an opportunity to do something, they jump in, right? And they get status rewards from doing that. Everybody's watching this happen, while the vast majority of people do not participate. And finally, there's a low risk of harm from security services. And in many ways, this is some of the biggest mysteries of this event, which was, why was it so easy for this mob to break into the Capitol? There are several different explanations that are circulating out there that we don't have time maybe to evaluate now, but I'll just mention, right? The worst case would be, okay, this was a coup and there was some amount of collusion, preparation, assistance from security services. We don't see a whole lot of evidence of that, but what we do see is a Capitol Police Force and a DC police force that perhaps was overcorrecting from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of the summer and not wanting to see a heavy militarized police and security force presence, and therefore said, don't get involved, right? And so that created this reticence to be involved. There certainly are questions of white privilege and structural racism, right? This is something that probably struck most observers of this event, that the police seemed less reticent to get involved violently than they were in the previous demonstrations over the summer. But the thing that really distinguishes this event, the event of January 6th, from what happened before or any other time, and I think was very, very confusing for security services, was the involvement of the President of the United States, with the President of the United States saying words that had the effect of inciting this mob to violence, right? His supporters, right? This is someone that is directly or indirectly in their chain of command, or at least kind of in their sense of the legitimate authority of the country. And now it is turning on itself. So I think that creates a great deal of ambiguity in the moment, which starts to create that uncertainty about what's going on. Lastly, I want to just a couple of things that I think were surprising to me, again, watching this mob, and gives me some the reason that I look at this as kind of an opportunistic movement rather than an organized movement, was just looking at kind of the look of surprise and fascination and excitement on the faces of the protesters themselves, of the rioters themselves, as they broke in. They were as surprised as everybody watching that they had actually penetrated the Capitol. They didn't quite know where to go. They didn't quite know what to do. If they would have found somebody, we would have been looking at outcomes even more tragic. But the lack of planning and preparation amongst the movement as itself was really, really surprising, right? No movement to make a declaration to seize power. So I think that in a sense, that might be a relief that there was not a kind of a planned, organized attempt to overthrow the government. But in some sense, this is also even more difficult and dangerous, because now we're thinking about a large-scale social movement that we need to understand and try and diffuse and defang going forward. So I think that's a great segue to Alexandra. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit, like, what are we dealing with, right? What is it in American culture that gives rise to this potential, and how it emerged on January 6th?
Well, thanks so much, John, for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. And thanks also to the always excellent and skilled Monk staff who make these events happen. You're absolutely right. We are facing some really important questions in American life. And so I'm going to be talking just for a few minutes about the relationship between populist rhetoric and populist violence, and about the patterns that really begin to emerge quickly and startlingly when we start paying attention to how people make the case for breaking the law and making political change at the point of a gun. So on January 6th in the Capitol, when the insurrectionists were asked by reporters, why are you here? What are you doing? What are you hoping for? We heard a lot of repeated answers, and here are some of them. Some of the citizens said, because they work for us. They don't get to steal from us. Other people said, we want our country back. And really the refrain that was heard most often was, because this is our country. This is our house. And, sometimes grammar is instructive. And this is one of those moments, I think. The plural possessive of our is useful here. It invokes this multitude of rightful possessors, right? A collective voice, not one leader, but a unified body politic, who own, right? The our is possessive through inheritance, our house, our country. This is a battlefield cry. It's also a theory of the insurrection from the throats of the insurrectionists. And it suggests that the Republic is not currently in our rightful hands, but is instead in your illegitimate hands. So it will not surprise you to hear that this binary is absolutely essential to populism. So this idea of the righteous and valid holders of power who are arrayed against the craven and corrupt and parasitic enemies of the people. That is just essential to populist rhetoric and practice. The establishment of existentially opposed and distinct citizens, us and them, ours and yours, really shows how incredibly highly personalized populism is. And we saw that on January 6th at the Capitol. This isn't just about beliefs. It's not a cool-headed debate about theory and practice. Populism is about identity. It's about bone and blood deep, nationalist, clannish, and often racialized identity. So that when the insurrectionists say, this is our house, the multitude of the we, the our here, that doesn't mean people who voted for Trump. It doesn't mean conservatives. It doesn't even mean registered Republicans. And it's not about voting record. It's not about party membership. We know this because Vice President Mike Pence was hunted through the building by some people who were calling for his assassination. So an unwavering allegiance to Trump over 4 years in the White House wasn't enough, right? The Capitol was no longer Mike Pence's house. I also want to note that populist rhetoric, which is what we see, paving the way to populist violence, it's not exactly causal, but there's a complex relationship between the two. Populist talk is really about a kind of forceful reclamation, right? About what is and what was and what will be ours. And that conflation of the time scale, right? That it was always already ours, it is temporarily and illegitimately not, but it will be again, is also key to populism. So we want our country back. Look, we can absolutely see this as just, it's simply like the next step, the rhetorical descendant of Make America Great Again, right? Many commentators have noted that MAGA is a semiotic that conjures an idealized and a noble past. And what is implied here in both MAGA and in We Want Our Country Back is that our country and our house are not your country and your house, that they have been unjustly stolen, like the election. And this assertion of criminality is just so important to our conversation about populism and violence. It's an essential step in legitimating violence as not just a viable, but even an ethical and a just way of making America great again, of taking back what was already ours, right? What was already ours by birthright, by an inborn identity test that Mike Pence failed, according to the insurrectionists on January 6th. So I just want to point us to a couple of historical examples so we can see some of the echoes of this populist rhetoric that we heard just this month, but has deep and long and important roots. So here are some famous words. When a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce citizens under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. That's how the Declaration of Independence puts it. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that the War for Independence wasn't a populist revolt. It was a profoundly populist revolt that really cannily, effectively, and deliberately used populist rhetoric. So look, I want to be as clear as it is possible to be clear. I am not suggesting an equivalence between the founders who took up pen and arms in order to declare themselves citizens and not colonists. I'm not declaring an equivalence between those citizens and the Americans who stormed the Capitol. They stormed it specifically to disenfranchise millions of their fellow citizens, right? And it's worth noting that some of them came armed with zip ties, some of them built a gallows and hung a noose. And by doing so, they brought lynching, right? That extra legal terrorism and that key mode of white supremacy all throughout the Jim Crow era to the seat of representative democracy. And we are making a mistake if we say that was just a few people and it's just an empty old historical symbol. It means something really important to see a hangman's noose, that technology of white supremacy present in an attempt to disenfranchise millions of voters, many of whom are Black and Brown Americans. Okay, so really, I just want to close by saying that the echo of the founders' rhetoric and philosophy that we see in the Declaration of Independence, that is so unmistakable in January 6th, is not accidental. And we should be attentive to how that heritage of liberty, how the view of Americans as innately unruly resistance fighters is at work in contemporary populist discourse. Because the thing is that populist violence is always depicted as moral, regardless of whether or not it breaks the law. Populists claim that they are hewing to a higher law and a deeper truth than just legislation or faddish social mores. So I want to remind you here about Sarah Palin's lionization of what she called the real America, invoking an ersatz republic, and Donald Trump's insistence that Barack Obama couldn't have been born in America so wasn't a real American or a real president, which was nothing more than the assertion that a Black man is always a counterfeit citizen. That distinction between true and false, real and fake, is also at the heart of populist politics. So I want to leave you with one final example. This is another historical quote. "There are millions who have never joined us, but who think and feel and who, when called upon, fight with us. This is our real strength, and no one who ignores it can hope to understand America today." And those words were written by Hiram Wesley Evans, who was the imperial wizard and emperor of the Ku Klux Klan in 1926, in exactly the same period of time when Birth of a Nation was played at the White House under the aegis of President Woodrow Wilson, who called it favorably history written in lightning. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And I think that those comments really lead well into Carmen's discussion, because you highlight this imagined community which has been used to justify so many human rights abuses throughout American history, and also in the last 4 years, right? I mean, these are abuses of human rights that become moralized and normalized. So the question to you, Carmen, given this history of abuse and the potential for abuse in the future, how do we think about justice and accountability? Because on the one hand, like that seems obvious, right? Something terrible happened. It echoes these other terrible events. It was threatening more and more of the same. And yet we have Biden in this incredibly cathartic ceremony calling for unity, right? And people wanting to move on and actually address these other impinging crises of the pandemic and a collapsed global economy and climate change and racial justice, right? How do we get to accountability in this situation?
So thanks so much for that question, John, and for convening this conversation. It's really wonderful to be back at the Monk School and in such terrific company. As John mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Justice and Accountability, and we're a human rights organization based in the United States. We work globally with communities impacted by conflict and state violence, particularly war crimes and so-called atrocity crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and torture. And I tell you all this so that you have a bit of context for where my remarks are coming from. Because based on what we've learned through our work, the question here for me isn't so much what are the prospects or the possibility for accountability, because there are Americanists and pundits who will have a far more sophisticated read on the political realities of my country, but rather what long-term unity and stability is even possible if we continue to ignore accountability for abuses in this country. Over and again, we have seen that impunity for the violations of today lead to the atrocities of tomorrow. John and Alexandra touched on some of the historical and political roots of how we got here and the implications of what happened on January 6th. I would add another observation. After years of impunity for racist violence and just a general sense that anyone carrying out President Trump's bidding would eventually be pardoned, we simply should not be astonished that the insurrectionists who erected gallows outside the Capitol or the politicians who incited them thought they could act without consequence. And so for me, accountability is critical. And I think it's important to recognize that accountability can take many forms. It's not just about prosecutions, though oftentimes we conflate prosecution for accountability and vice versa. But the point of accountability is ultimately non-recurrence. And so a broad conception of what constitutes accountability is necessary when we think about that. At core, what we're talking about when we speak of accountability is truth, justice, and ultimately redress. So what that means is that the public needs to know the facts so we can start developing a shared understanding and a common narrative of what happened. This is always critical for accountability, but even more so in the environment that we live in right now, where truth and common shared factual understanding of the world is not something to be taken for granted. But without that shared narrative and shared understanding, we can't even begin to bring together a society. Of course, deterrence through meaningful consequences for wrongdoing is important and another key prong of accountability. And sometimes that deterrence would come in the form of, criminal sanction, but there are other forms of deterrence as well, such as the impeachment that we're seeing happen right now. And most importantly, there needs to be remedy for harms. The conversation, the events that brought us together today, focus on what happened on January 6th, and there are certainly those who were directly harmed through those events that require remedy too. But I would say that the conversation around remedy in the United States for human rights violations goes far beyond that. The Department of Justice has announced dozens of indictments against individuals who have been accused of being part of the mob that overran the Capitol. For me, this is a little like prosecuting the street-level drug dealers while the kingpins remain at large. It's probably necessary, but absolutely insufficient. And in the context of political violence, we've seen what happens when political leaders who incite violence are not held to account. The violence simply continues. If not immediately, then eventually. So let me give you just one of many international examples from the work that we've done at CJA. So for several years now, we've been working with journalists and human rights defenders in Sri Lanka who have been trying, with very little success, to seek accountability for grave abuses committed by the government of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who served as president from 2005 to 2015. The conduct that's been alleged against him and his government range from corruption to war crimes to targeted attacks on journalists. And like former President Trump, Mahinda Rajapaksa stacked his administration with family members, which included his brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who served as his Secretary of Defense. And as Secretary of Defense a decade ago, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was accused of war crimes and using the military to target, kidnap, and kill journalists whose coverage he considered unfavorable. Perhaps unsurprisingly, accountability for those abuses was not at all possible during his brother's presidency. The Rajapaksa government eventually got voted out of office. However, the successor government chose to forego accountability for the Rajapaksas so the country could move on. What eventually happened over the course of a decade was that the Rajapaksas were given the opportunity to reconsolidate their support. And in late 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected president of Sri Lanka. Immediately, there were reports of attacks on journalists and crackdowns on human rights defenders. The journalists and investigators we were working with have fled the country. Some have sought asylum in Canada and elsewhere. The human rights defenders that we continue to work with, some of them have gone into hiding. And so in the aftermath of atrocity, there are so many warning signs of what's to come. And a too common thread is that failure to hold the powerful to account for violations big and small create a culture of impunity where the unthinkable becomes a reality. So I am really looking forward to the conversation here today. So I will just end with something that I said to John last week. On January 6th, when I saw that violent insurrectionist mob overrun the US Capitol, my first thought wasn't really about the assault on the symbol of American democracy, or even registering that the executive had called for attack on a co-equal branch of government. Rather, it was a more visceral response. It was also almost like a muscle memory. I thought of the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, how the Burmese military incited genocide against the Rohingya through coded messages and dog whistles on Facebook. I thought of the 2002 massacre of Muslims in Gujarat, India, where Narendra Modi, now the Prime Minister of India, but then at the time the Chief Minister of Gujarat, was accused of inciting and condoning the violence, which left over 1,000 dead. So from my vantage point, doing nothing at this moment is not an option. The trade-off isn't whether we pursue accountability or unity or peace versus justice. What is at stake is whether we condemn ourselves to the risk of even greater horrors. But in that response, I think we also need to be balanced and proportional. And perhaps most importantly, learn from the lessons of almost two decades of this so-called war on terror in the United States. And so I can think of no one better to walk us through that than Kent.
Exactly, Carmen. I'm so glad you mentioned the war on terror, because, Ken, as we start to think about the implications of 1/6, right? 9/11 certainly comes to mind. The United States reacted very dramatically, went to its own extremes to try and combat that. Are there lessons that should be learned or should not be learned from that experience? And what are the differences in thinking about combating right-wing extremism?
Well, thank you very much, John, and to the Monk School for organizing it, and for all of you to tuning in. I mean, when I saw what happened, I related this to what we see as the rise in far-right violence or terrorism, whether it was in Christchurch or Dylan Roof in Charlottesville. Far-right political violence and terrorism has been increasing. And in the United States, as indeed in Canada, we've not treated it like terrorism. And this of course raises the issue of double standards. And so for those of you that are interested, Shirin Sanar has an excellent article in a recent Michigan law review about this double standard. And I agree with Professor Sanar about the double standard, and I've written about that in the Canadian context, and more recently in a recent article in Common Law World on right-wing terrorism. But I guess where I differ, and this goes to John's point about 9/11, is that I realize that there is a real temptation, especially after what we saw, to simply level up and to treat far-right terrorism as terrorism, with the assumption that what has been done with respect to terrorism is appropriate. And as Carmen has hinted at, I obviously have some real concerns about that. I also, and this goes to John's point about the exceptionality of the U.S., I wonder, right, that there were debates in Congress before this about creating new domestic terrorism legislation. But the US history of dealing with terrorism, both before and after 9/11, has been that the US state, in large part because of the First Amendment, has been much more comfortable dealing with this as a foreign issue, whether it's through extrajudicial assassinations carried out under both the Obama and Trump presidencies, immigration law, Guantanamo, etc. So I think that there will be an interesting debate within the United States about whether beefed up powers about domestic terrorism are indeed necessary. And of course, we in Canada know about this because the Harper government was very quick when our parliament was attacked to use that as a pretext to come up with new counterterrorism laws that I didn't believe were really necessary. So in terms of accountability, I think one of the very important parts that we have to deal with is accountability within the security forces. And this, I think, is in some ways one of the most important things to be looking at, is that the differences between policing Black Lives Matter and policing far-right mobs are obvious to everyone. But we really need that accountability to go in both at the individual and the organizational level. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between terrorism and insurgency. And again, this is another reason for my caution about adopting the American approach to counterterrorism and applying it to the far right. I mean, we've seen some gestures. The Imperial Russian movement has been added to the list of foreign terrorist groups. But, again, coming up with a domestic list is going to raise huge First Amendment problems. And I also worry a little bit about the backlash. And so what I hope is that in some ways this may that accountability has many forms. There is individual accountability, which in some cases is right, and the charges have not been particularly severe so far, but I do think that they are appropriate, that we shouldn't perpetuate the double standards when it comes to prosecutions. But there's also kind of social accountability. And I think just like the October crisis in Canada really led a political movement within Quebec to renounce political violence, it's my hope that this will happen in the United States. So the most recent opinion poll that I've seen suggests about 8% of the polled population supports what happened on January 6th. I think that number is way too high, but I think it is a better number than the number who support Trump, which was even in the worst of this during the up in the 40%. So I do think that we need to have accountability both at the individual, organizational, and societal level, but we shouldn't think that the instruments of counterterrorism that have done much harm to human rights and has not solved the terrorism problem. Even now, Daesh is rising again in Iraq and will continue. We should not think that that's going to solve this problem that we saw on January 6th. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of the panelists. We've got about 25 minutes left. We've got the audience that's sending some questions in. I want to encourage anybody who hasn't yet to please get your questions in, and we'll try and answer them. And while we're waiting there, Kent, I think I'm going to actually throw the first one to you. This is from Kara, and she asks, what are the implications for Canada here? Canadians share much in common with the United States. Canadians may take some comfort in thinking that there are things that set us apart from Americans, but in the wake of this insurrection, what similarities in Canadian and American political culture should be cause for concern here in Canada?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, one of the most worrying is if we get into a situation where the political neutrality of our police, army, and security agencies is not beyond reproach. So we know that in Canada, we have an issue of far-right adherence in the Canadian military. The attempt on Trudeau's life, which has not received much publicity, had elements of that, the man who crashed into Rideau Hall. So to me, it is very, very important that we rely upon our institutions to deal with these issues, because, especially juxtaposed with the policing of Black Lives Matter, once the neutrality of policing and other security agencies falls into doubt, then we are on this road that Carmen pointed out, that unfortunately other countries, much less fortunate than Canada and the United States, have followed. The next thing is obviously to think about political parties as another very important institution. And so I think, I'd be interested in what you think, John, about this as a political scientist. But I think that what happens within the Republican Party is extremely important. And of course, the recent acts in ejecting Derek Sloan from the Conservative Party, I think, are extremely important. So those are our two institutions, and I do think that, to strike a note that many of you have already struck, that it does cast America in a different light when we're talking about safeguarding basic institutions that many of us encounter as part of works in trying to build democracies or of transitional justice. So the fact that we're talking about the neutrality of security agencies is something that I'm familiar with in Tunisia and other places, but is just as relevant, unfortunately, in both of our countries today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So I have several questions with people questioning my questioning of the coup appellation. So I thought I might address that a little bit. People pointing out there might have been a plan. Certainly there was an attempt to overthrow the government. Isn't this just academic hair splitting? And I guess my response to that is that getting the diagnosis right matters because different treatment plans follow from different diagnoses. So when we think about this as a coup or an organized violent movement, right, the tools that you use to address that are to root out the conspiracy, organize counterterrorism forces and surveillance against those organized networks in order to purge your security forces and roll up those organized efforts, okay? And if it's a social movement, on the one hand, that's a little bit of a relief, right? Because the whole point of organized movements is they can survive and persist despite a whole lot of counterterrorism attention. That's why Daesh continues to survive despite many, many, many reincarnations, right? It has gone through this Darwinian process to become very, very robust and entrenched as an underground bureaucratic organization. A social movement, right? On the one hand, okay, like it's not organized, but it's this frothy wave of rivalry, contagion, and resentment that is drawing on, some of these kind of symbolic resources that Alexandra is talking about. And if you apply the counterterrorism model, right, you may exacerbate those grievances even more. And like where it starts to get into the uncomfortable questions are like, what's the relationship between right and left? What's the relationship between polarization writ large in the United States? What's the relationship between the ways that we're describing this? Because right now, everybody's angry and upset, and it's easy to take kind of the moral high ground and say, there must be justice for this thing. But if it's a social movement, right, then the things that are producing that pathology are potentially going to be very, very, very difficult to root out. And I think some people are kind of really paying attention, but this is only entering kind of the popular debate now. And we're at risk of pushing under. Carmen, this is something that you and I have talked about. I don't know if you have thoughts about how this dynamic works and whether it makes a difference on how we think about this.
Well, I think that it just goes back to, I think, when you were talking about that, I think it goes back to this idea that we have to have a broad conception of accountability beyond just simply saying that there has to be consequences for the individuals or leaders who were responsible for this. We have to think about accountability in all of its aspects. And I think when we're thinking about how to address what is fundamentally a social ill, that idea of developing those shared narratives and this common understanding of what the facts were of what happened. I mean, that's why the role of commissions are so important, to really suss out what happened and have one set of facts so that we operate from a position of fact as opposed to belief is really critical for accountability in a broader sense.
Okay, great. Thank you. Alexandra, I think I'm going to pass this next question to you and anybody else who wants to jump in on this. Tara asks, are there any opinions on the Republican Party that we should draw? Is Trump an accurate representation of the political party, or was this just a matter of a bad leader in representation at this particular time?
I think that's a question that Americans and in fact people across the world have been asking since before Trump took that infamous ride down the escalator to announce his campaign. I think that insisting that Trump is an exception that he was sprung from the head of Zeus, exonerates the Republican Party from any responsibility. I think it's a way of maintaining American exceptionalism and insisting that the Republic, which is so deeply embedded in values of freedom and democracy, could never produce or vote for by the tens of millions someone who was clearly looking to be an authoritarian. So I resist the idea that he is distinct. I don't think, as many other scholars and commentators have noted, I think the problem isn't Trump, it's Trumpism. And I think Trumpism is not done. And we need to think about its long roots and its long futurity. Trump left by saying, I'm not really gone. And those aren't empty words. I think we need to think about what institutional and electoral forms produced tolerance for this kind of norm breaking and for the open articulation of white supremacy and the attempt to institutionalize white supremacy that was so much a part of the Trump years. So I think this is a long story, and that these 4 years are not the beginning and the end.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I agree with what Alexandria said. I mean, just to point out some more mundane things. The 10 that voted in the House to impeach are all now seemingly being subject to primaries, including Lynn Cheney. So again, I think this fits into this idea that this is not an exceptional blip. And I agree with what Alexandra says about white supremacy, but I'd also would draw on the links between Trump and Roy Cohn and the McCarthy era. And one of my worries, is, and I see this in security forces all the time, is that let's say Trump is acquitted in the Senate, which I think most people think is probably going to happen unless something earth-shattering comes up. Is that going to be translated into he did nothing wrong, or it's just another witch hunt? I mean, this is some of the same dilemmas that I have with criminal prosecutions of police officers, as necessary as they are sometime to maintain the rule of law. We also have to deal with a narrative that suggests that an acquittal means that the person was somehow persecuted, or that what the person did was somehow acceptable. And to me, those are extremely different questions, perhaps because I think about that like a lawyer. So that Trump being trying to stage a comeback if he's not impeached in some ways is something that I'll be looking for during the next year.
Okay, here's another great question on context, right? And this is, what degree of blame for political violence would you place on the pandemic? And we might add the economic ramifications of the pandemic as well, specifically for creating more isolation, fear, and misinformation that creates false realities for the insurrectionists. Do we think the insurrection would have happened without the pandemic? And this is such a fascinating question. Counterfactuals are always tough to disentangle. But I will kind of step back and note that one thing that all political crises and wars have in common is that they're very surprising to some degree, right? There's always some confluence of events and circumstances that we didn't quite anticipate. And that's what gives rise to political violence. Which, once you think about, okay, the point of institutions is to create more regular, predictable forms of transactions in societies, right? So it's when you find circumstances that find the vulnerabilities, that find the flaws, that you can have these problems emerge. So, in that respect, right, that I think directs our attention to the importance of context. And I think mentioning social media is really, really important here. I do a lot of work on cybersecurity. Most of kind of looking critically at the threat narratives, which are usually on cyber 9/11s and cyber Pearl Harbors and kind of large scale destruction of societies through hacking. And yet this is a situation in which social media worked just fine. Nobody broke it technologically, but because it worked just fine, it became an incredible vehicle for enabling the contagion of ideas, enabling people to find each other, recommending like communities and like ideas that resemble things they were already looking at, right? So the normal operation of these technologies ended up being a far more dangerous threat than we have seen anywhere else in kind of empirical cybersecurity to date. So that itself is really interesting. And the fact that the pandemic has driven more and more of us online to spend time trying desperately to create some community, I think it's a really, really worthwhile hypothesis to entertain. And I think we're going to have to start to unpack that. Okay. Mark Kirsten, he's another Monk Fellow, is weighing in with another question on accountability. And he's asking about the costs and benefits of focusing on locating and prosecuting the hundreds of right-wing foot soldiers as opposed to focusing on those more responsible, the Trumps, the Giulianis, et cetera, whether focusing on the former risk distracting from the hard business of achieving accountability with the latter. What do you think, Carmen?
Asked like a true international criminal law scholar that he is. So I have two thoughts about that. I think the first is, on the question of going after the foot soldiers. In the United States, the context that we're thinking about this is tricky because, Kent alluded to this, but there is this question of parity and of what is fair when it comes to our criminal justice system when, folks are arrested for engaging in completely silent, peaceful protests at the Capitol all the time. And to say nothing of what happened over the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. And to not go after the individual insurrectionists here seems like a gross disparity in the application of law and the application of, just the entire criminal legal system in the United States. So it's hard because when you start with a baseline of just over policing, then a response that is premised on sort of equity or equality will also result in perhaps inefficient or over policing. So I think that's one strand of thought. The second strand is that, I don't know, as the Americans like to say, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Like the government has so much money. And so for me, it's not really about resources. Like, can the DOJ deal with low-level prosecutions while also, our institutions doing the hard political work ultimately of holding our political leaders accountable for this. I don't think it's quite the same kind of trade-off that we might be speaking about when we're thinking about it at sort of maybe like the ICC level, where we do make decisions to go after the most responsible when it comes to serious international crime.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with Carmen that, I think the danger of allowing impunity for those who broke into the Capitol and did what they did is great. But I also take some comfort in that there's a degree of fair labeling in which about the offenses that they're being charged with. So, I mean, it may be that we're going to see seditious conspiracy charges, but I don't think that is, that is something that is going to have have to come from the higher ups. And the fact that that is more difficult also goes back to what I talked about, is that a lot of our security forces and intelligence agencies and the FBI have not focused as much as they should have on far-right violence, right? That one of the differences between the prosecutions of those inspired by Daesh and far-right violence is that many of the Daesh people are apprehended before, long before they do violence, often through undercover stings, often through wiretaps, whereas far-right violence, both in the United States and Canada, is only apprehended after, sometimes chalked up to mental illness. And this raises, I think, a very provocative question that the German theorist Gunter Jacobs has raised, which is, are our modern terrorism laws a form of enemy criminal law that we apply against those who we see as external enemies and do not apply consistent with the rule of law to our fellow citizens? And so, I think we do need to respond to far-right violence, but there are, double standards built in to that response by the fact that, and this may change, but certainly in the 20 years or so after 9/11, far-right violence was not as high a priority for proactive, preventive law enforcement as terrorism inspired by Daesh or Al-Qaeda.
Okay, thank you. So we have just a few more minutes, and there's a ton more questions, which I think is just indicative of how long this conversation can and should go on. And I feel pretty confident in saying that the Monk School is probably going to be organizing more events to talk about this, and more different voices will be involved. So let's just take the last couple of minutes, and I'll go around the table here and see if there are just any kind of last final comments. Alexandra, maybe we can start with you.
Thanks, John. I just want to mention that when we're trying to make sense of these sort of populist moments, right, this sort of influx of populist rhetoric, populist strategy, populist ideology, voting patterns, we really need to pay attention to the context, because virtually all populists, whether they're on the left or on the right, and populism is absolutely not sectarian, right? There are leftist populists, there are rightist populists, that virtually all populists will claim the moral high ground, claim to be the sole legitimate inheritors of the Patriot legacy, and will insist that their political enemies be excluded from the social compact, right, are not essentially Americans. And so we need to learn to be better readers of the context around that. And one way to do that is to say, we know, to refer back to Carmen's, excellent reminder, that we need to have a baseline of truth and facts, that the 2020 presidential election was not stolen, but we can see the insurrection as an attempt to steal that election, which did not work. And so that context can help us make sense of populist claims, which almost universally make use of the same tropes and sort of symbolic language. So I just leave you with that as a way of kind of navigating our way through what promises to be many more years of this kind of rhetoric being a really influential part of our public life.
Great, thank you, Alexandra. Carmen.
So I think my wrap up would really be one that's rooted in my own positionality as a person of color living in the United States, which is, I think that when events like this, which feel shocking, which feel like gross injustices, which feel like a side of the country that, oh my gosh, we've never seen before. It isn't a side of the country that, oh my gosh, we've never seen before. It's just a part of the country that, oh my gosh, the people who hold positions of privilege and power in this country have never seen before. And so all of the daily injustices and indignities that that structural and systemic racism has wrought in the United States that happen every minute, every day. This is in some ways just so unsurprising because nothing has been done about those abuses, which are small and which are common. And so when it erupts and sort of, realizes its full potential in really dramatic ways, there's just something that feels, unfortunately, just very inevitable about it.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And I think my comments, I just wanted to echo what Carmen said, but I think it applies to the way that we understand the dynamics in the American polity in general. If we want to celebrate the diversity of the American experience, which we should, we also need to celebrate, or excuse me, recognize and study the similarities that the United States has and always has had with every other country that political scientists and sociologists and legal scholars and humanists study, right? These are not new to the United States. They may be new to awareness, but that diversity, right, is not just a bunch of good things to be celebrated. It's a lot of ugly things to be recognized as well. And the question going forward is, how do you manage that froth and that potential? Because there's not going to be kind of a leveling, which is going to be satisfying, nor would we want it to be, for any one group or the other. Ken, you'll get the last word in the next 20 seconds.
Yes, well, I would just hope that if, as expected, the Senate does acquit Trump, that the Congress as a whole balances this out with the sort of fact-based investigation that Carmen called for, because I think that in and of itself is one of many levers of accountability moving forward.
Okay, well, I am weirdly reminded at this moment of the famous nuclear arms controller toast, which is, to peace, may it require more study. I think that's applicable here as well. Thanks very much for a fantastic panel. Thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. Stay tuned, we'll have more events like this, and thank you for being a part of this conversation.